Ooh,
All right. So it's preparing to go live on Facebook.
all right.
All right. So we are now live. All right. Hello, everybody. This is Deanna with ComiConway, and we are here today with Tom Cook. Just a little introduction about Tom Cook. He is best known for his work on Saturday morning cartoon series. He started working with Hanna-Barbera Studios, where he was an assistant animator on shows like Godzilla, Scooby Doo, Smurfs, Pacman, the Flintstones. Then he moved over to Filmation Studios, where he worked on Tarzan, Flash Gordon, He-Man, Masters of the Universe, and Ghostbusters. Then he was also a timing director for several shows as well. Then he also worked on several animated motion pictures, such as Walt Disney's Prince and the Pauper and the Jetsons movie. So thank you, Tom, for being with us today.
My pleasure.
So the first question that a lot of people like to start with is, how did you get started drawing? Was it a hobby you picked up as a kid?
Yeah, well, I kind of always liked to draw, but I never ever thought I would ever, do anything with it. My dad had saved me a bunch of Big Little books when he was a kid, that like Dick Tracy and Buck Rogers, and every other page was story and art. So it was like story art for like 400 pages. So it was really filled with artwork. And so I kind of started sketching some of those things like Dick Tracy and stuff. But then what really got me started drawing was when Marvel Comics came out. And I was camping in the backyard with a buddy of mine, reading comic books by flashlight. And he pulls out this Spider-Man comic. It was actually issue number 4. So this has got to be 1963, somewhere around there. So I'm about 11 years old. And I just love the artwork in this comic. So I traded him a bunch of comics for that one comic book. And then I would just sit and draw, whatever Steve Ditko had drawn. I would find a good pose, and then I would kind of try to copy it on my own without having to trace it or anything.
Right.
And then eventually you get to the point where you say, okay, well, I want to try to do my own posing. And, usually it's pretty terrible to begin with, but, slowly you get better and better and better. And that's kind of what got me started drawing. And so Marvel Comics really had the biggest part to do with that.
Okay. That's really cool that so you basically did tracing, or not tracing, but
yeah, it was just copying someone else's drawing so I could kind of get in my mind what they were thinking when they drew it. And then you just take that from, you see how they did it, and then you try to do your own version, but a different pose.
Right. So at what point did you realize you could make that a career?
Man, I mean, that took a long time before I figured that out, because we moved from New York to California in 1968. So I was about 16 years old. And even then, I mean, I never really thought I'd work in any sort of art business, because I just wouldn't even know how to start. I kind of knew that if you wanted to be in comic books at that point, you had to live in New York. And I had just moved from New York. So that wasn't going to happen. But I really wasn't interested in doing comic books anyway, because I didn't really like drawing backgrounds.
Mm-hmm.
So doing buildings and stuff, that wasn't what I liked. I liked doing the characters. And so now you have to kind of fast forward to 1977 or 78. And I'm a bus driver in Los Angeles, transit bus driver for the Rapid Transit District, just taking people to and from work, and basically just taking people, even that want to go to the store, and they just jump on the bus and I drive until we get to the, and so one day it was my day off, and I went out to get the mail at my apartment, and it was just a bunch of junk mail. So I threw it on my kitchen table and went and made a sandwich and sat down to eat the sandwich. And as I'm eating, I saw this little pamphlet in that group of junk mail. So I pulled the pamphlet out and started to just kind of thumb through it to see what it was. And it was a local college, Cal State Northridge, which at that point was San Fernando Valley State College. And it was their extension courses that they were going to be teaching during the summer. And so it must have been 78, the summer of 78, because this was right at the beginning of summer when I saw this pamphlet. And in there was this comic book class. And I wanted to learn more about comic books and how they were made. And the teacher was a guy named Don Rico, who I knew as a comic book artist. You know, I knew him from Captain America and Daredevil back in the 50s. And so I wanted to take the class, number one, to meet him, and then number two, to learn a little bit more about comic book creation. And the first day he had us bring our portfolios in. So I brought in all my drawings of superheroes and stuff that I had done. And after the class, he kind of said, "Hey, Tom, can I talk to you for a minute?" And, you know, I'm kind of thinking maybe I'm in trouble already. And he goes, "No," he says, I work at Hanna-Barbera as a storyboard artist. And we're doing a show called Challenge of the SuperFriends. And we need people that can draw superheroes, that could draw regular human characters pretty well. We have a lot of people that could draw Scooby Doo and Fred Flintstone, but they're cartoony and it's kind of a different style. And I really like your superheroes. Would you be interested if I recommend you to Hanna-Barbera? They have a class on Thursday nights to learn basic animation. It's free. And you just come into the studio and they teach you whatever. And sometimes they'll hire out of the class. So I'm like, oh my gosh, yes, of course I want to do that. So I went down and interviewed with the guy that was running the class, and he immediately called Joe Barbera down. And Joe Barbera came in and he said, "Look at this guy's artwork." And he was like, "Well, we would hire you right now, but we don't have any room in the studio. We're so packed. So we're going to leave you in the class, and eventually we'll hire out of the class." And 3 weeks later, I get hired.
Nice.
And the rough thing is, I don't know anything. You know, I've been in the class for like 3 weeks. I've done like a really, really bad in-between because I had no idea what an in-between was until this class. So I had no knowledge about animation. And here they are, they're going to hire me. So I went to the director and I kind of told him, I said, "You know, I don't know if you realize, but I really don't know anything about what I'm doing." And he said, "Well, don't worry about it. You're going to be an assistant animator to one of the animators, and he will kind of guide you along as to what you're supposed to do." So I still didn't feel good about it. So I took the job, but I did not quit my bus driver job. I just took a leave of absence. And about 2 or 3 weeks into the job, the animator said to me, "Hey, you're picking this up really fast." So I thought, okay, maybe it's safe enough to quit my job now, because the bus driver job was a really well-paying job with good benefits and everything else. I don't want to get this job and crash and burn in a month and be out of a job. So so that's kind of how I got started.
It's really really good.
It's really lucky.
Yes, I was gonna say that's very lucky that you just happened to be on your lunch break.
Yeah.
So talking about being at Hanna-Barbera, what was the process like producing classic American animation back when you were doing the Saturday morning cartoons and when you got hired at Hanna-Barbera? Because
Right.
everything has pretty much gone digital. So I'm fascinated to know how the classic animation was produced.
Right. Yeah. It's you know, it started out with like somebody would come up with the story. You know, the show's already been purchased or whatever, because we didn't, as an animator, you don't have anything to say about character design or anything. You know, I don't have anything to do with the story. My job is to make the characters act on screen. So now this is at Hanna-Barbera, so I'm just an assistant. So I'm even a step below that. So what happened is somebody comes up with a story. They do this storyboard, which is kind of like a comic book that shows each scene and how it's going to be, you know, what size they're going to be and what they're going to do in that scene. Then they take each one of those storyboard panels and they make it into a layout, which is done at the size that we drew at, which is about, I don't know, 11 by 14. And that would show us at the correct size what we were going to draw and what was going to go on in the scene as well. So now we had the animator would listen to the soundtrack, so he would hear the voice and figure out what he wanted the character to do as he's talking. Because you've got the voice artist who does the voice, but he really has nothing to do with how the character is going to act in the show. That's up to the animator. Then the animator would do roughs of what he wanted the scene to be. And then I would go in and clean up those roughs as his assistant and put a really nice quality line on it and make sure the character's on model. And then I would do the in-betweens. And that's basically, you know, if the guy's got a hand here drawn and over here it's a closed fist, I have to draw all the ones in between to make that close. So you might have 7 or 8 drawings as he closes a hand.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a method of doing that where you just put one drawing on top of the other on your light board, and then you could see through the other pieces and see where the hand was and where it's going. And then you would literally draw in between that other drawing. And once you got that drawing done, then there was another in between that and the other drawing. So it would slowly get to the point where it would be done. And so that's what my job was, to do that.
Okay.
And then after those are done, they're Xeroxed onto a cell, painted, and then filmed. And that's how you ended up with an episode.
Well, I was going to say, about how long did it take to get an episode, knowing you have to go through all of those steps?
Yeah, it took, at Hanna-Barbera, it was a little bit different than it was at Filmation, because at Filmation we did, He-Man was a syndicated show. So instead of only 13 episodes per season, which is that's what Scooby Doo was, we suddenly had 65 episodes to do per season, because it was on Monday through Friday instead of just Saturday morning.
Right.
So we had less than a week to get a show done at Filmation. At Hanna-Barbera, we had a couple of weeks, to get each show done. And so it was a lot more time. With He-Man, we were just jamming like crazy for an entire year. With Hanna-Barbera, it was a little bit better as far as time. Between scenes, you could take a little bit more time, draw a little bit nicer, a little bit more full animation. It still had to be limited animation, but you could get away with a little bit more because there was more time to get it done. Time was the enemy.
Right.
That was the thing.
I can only imagine how time was the enemy.
Yeah.
So you did mention a little bit about you had no creative, you didn't have any creative control, but did you have some type of control just based off of, you got the voice? Did you have a control of exactly what the character was doing as the assistant? And did you ever work your way up to having more control of the character?
Yeah, no, as an assistant, you're really just following up on what the animator did. The animator's the one that made the character do what he wanted him to do. He is still under the control of the director. So if the director looks at what you did and says, I don't really like that, he would make you change it. It would really have to be bad, though, because like I said, with the time constraints, you really can't go back and redo a whole scene.
Right.
He might say, just trying to fix this a little bit and make that a little bit better. And, I don't really care for what you did here, but it's still going to work for the show.
Yes.
And that's when I moved over to Filmation, I was still an assistant. And then I got a chance to become an animator on a show called Blackstar.
Okay.
And this was 1980. And so I'd been an assistant for a couple of years, and I had been doing animation at home and bringing it in and having them put it on the video machine, and I would show the directors. and then they would give me little hints of, okay, that looks really good, or that doesn't look quite good enough, try to fix this. So after showing them a bunch of different things I'd done, they finally said, okay, we're going to give you your first scenes as an animator, and we'll see how you do. And that was it. Once I got a chance to be an animator, I stayed an animator until I just started directing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So what do you think of how the animation industry has moved to digital? What are your thoughts on how that has progressed?
Well, I mean, I understand it because it's very, very the time it takes, and then having to ink and paint every cell when you can just do it on a computer so fast. I understand that saves a lot of money. I don't really like it. I wish we still had cells, because cells are really fun to collect and have a really nice piece of art. Well, now there's no cells anymore.
Right.
So, if you have a favorite cartoon, there's no way to buy something that's a piece of that show like there was. So I kind of dislike that part of it. I prefer the hand-drawn stuff. Now, when we first started doing on computer, we still drew it by hand and then scanned in the drawing. And so that still was what I prefer. But now with them just taking, because what they do now is they just would draw like a hand like this, and just take that one drawing and just turn it to make it look like it's moving, rather than actually drawing it moving, and changing shape. So everything tends to be the same thing over and over and over. If somebody, like if somebody's going to fly and they take off, well, there's just one drawing of them taking off all the way up, instead of us moving the arms and everything. So everything's a little bit less animated. And but again, I mean, I understand it's just it saves so much money not having to do all this other stuff. But I think the quality is not as good as it should be.
Right. So at what point did you switch to digital, or have you done a lot of digital work, or are you still doing?
No, I'm retired now, so I'm doing nothing.
Okay.
But
Okay.
no, but back, let's see, I'm gonna think. I ended up, once the animation industry kind of left, because they sent all the work over to Japan and Korea,
Mhm.
like in 1981, Hanna-Barbera actually closed their doors.
Yes.
And that's when I moved over to Filmation, because they weren't, the head of studio said, we're never going to send work overseas. So I thought, well, that's where I should be, because I'm not overseas. So,
Right.
so I left for Filmation. But in the 90s, when I moved to Seattle, I ended up getting a job at Microsoft. And it was right around 1995 when they came up with Softimage, which is one of the first computer programs to animate in a computer. And they kind of said, I don't know what we're going to do with this program, because we don't have any animators. And I'm an animator. And so they sent me to LA to learn this program. And of course, I had never even started a computer up before. So, I mean, it was really a steep learning curve, but
Okay.
I finally got it. After a couple of weeks, I finally figured it out. And so then that's what I was doing at Microsoft, was teaching people how to animate in a computer, because we had a lot of people who were really great at computers, but they never did animation, so they don't understand the process. So that's what I would do, is help them understand the process. And at the same time, they were teaching me more about how to use the computer, because it was still pretty rudimentary to me, And so that's kind of how I got into that. And then a little bit later on, I think it was right around 2000, 2001, somewhere in there, I got a job as an art director. And one of the things we're doing is cartoons for the computer. So you would just log on and you see your episode of whatever show that we were doing. They were, computers weren't very good yet. So we really couldn't do anything more than 3 minutes worth of an episode, because you just couldn't download it fast enough.
Right.
So we did these little cartoons. One of them was called Superhero Roommate, which you can still see. Dave Foley, the guy that was in News Radio, was the voice of the main character.
Oh, wow.
And it was really, we did it all in Flash. So I had to learn Flash because I never worked in Flash before. And that was a little bit more like good old animation where we drew everything, but it was those symbols like I was telling you about where we just turn the hand.
Right.
So we would draw like a forearm and we draw it, and then we could just animate the forearm going back and forth, and that's how we animated it. But it looked more like, cutout animation rather than actually hand drawn,
Right.
even though we hand drew the cutout part. And so we learned kind of how to do that. And so that was kind of my whole thing into digital, and where I still kind of bucked the system and wanted to draw everything that we could, but you had to like download all of the symbols that were going to be used so you could visualize them on your computer.
Right.
So we still had to be really cognizant of the fact that there's not much room and there's not much speed. So we had to really be careful how we did it.
Yeah, I can see going back thinking about computers in 1995 and how slow stuff downloaded. I can only imagine the frustration of trying to make it move in a timely fashion.
And just remember, when I started there in 95, Windows 95 first came out. It was the first Windows program.
Yes.
So, I mean, it was really at the very beginning of all this stuff.
Yes. So one thing that I did notice in your biography is that you were a timing director on several projects. What exactly is a timing director?
Well, it's basically we get the storyboard,
okay,
and we take and time out every scene that is going to be in that show. So, so you really literally go through the entire show. It's called slugging a board. And I have no idea what slugging means. It's just, that's what it's called. And you have to go in and say, okay. And a lot of times we use the stopwatch. And you would kind of listen to the soundtrack, see how, because you can't animate quicker than the soundtrack. So the voice had to be heard. And if the voice was like, say, 3 seconds, so you knew that scene had to be 3 seconds long, but then you might want to wait a beat before they start talking. When they get done, you might want them to do a little bit of business before the scene cuts to the next scene. And that was all up to the timing director. So this was a little bit more of like that power that you talk about to control the pace of the episode. With the animator, you're kind of stuck. You've got a scene and it's going to be 4 seconds long. You can't do something that isn't 4 seconds. You got to make sure it's 4 seconds. Me, I could go in and say, okay, this is such a good scene. Let's go 7 seconds on this scene and do this extra little bit in there. And so you had a little bit more control over what the episode was going to be like. And that was really fun because I was working on, there was something HBO did called the Happily Ever After Fairy Tales. And they were kind of different takes on the regular fairy tales. Like we had a Pinocchio episode. In the Pinocchio episode, Will Smith was the voice of Pinocchio. So we changed it over so that Pinocchio was a little black boy or black puppet to start with. And instead of the beautiful blonde blues fairy or blue fairy, we had the blues fairy, which is this big fat black guy with a saxophone that was playing blues music through the whole episode. So it was kind of like Pinocchio, but really a different take on it. And it was pretty fun and pretty funny. And I remember I did an episode with Goldilocks and the Three Bears, and Goldilocks was kind of like she had dreadlocks, and that was the locks part. And it was all like reggae music. And it was like, hey, Mon, this porridge doesn't taste very, it was all done in a Jamaican accent. And at one point, whoever did the storyboard didn't do it long enough. So there was like maybe a minute. where there was going to be no animation and it wasn't ready for commercial yet. So I called up the studio and I said, what do you want me to do with this? And they said, just come up with a scene. So I got to actually create my own scene and have it animated the way I wanted. And it was basically in this episode when they were eating the porridge, when she ate the cold porridge, she just said, oh, this is too cold, and then pushed it aside and went to the next one, which was too hot. Well, instead of saying this is too cold and just moving on, I had her when she had the porridge, a sheet of ice went over her. So it covered up her whole body. So she was frozen. And then she pulls out this little hammer and taps herself and it all cracks and falls off. So that wasted another 5-10 seconds, and so I did that throughout the show so I could make the show fit the time that it was supposed to be. And yet I got to actually create some stuff instead of just following what the storyline was. And they really liked that. They thought it was clever, and I thought it was kind of cool too.
That is really cool.
Yeah.
So going back to some of the things that you did do the animation on, what was it like having to do the Smurfs, where you had so many dozens of Smurfs with all different personalities in one scene at every every turn?
Well, that's one of the number one questions I usually get when I do panels and stuff is, what was your least favorite show to animate? And I always have to think a second. I go, wait a minute, why am I thinking? It was the Smurfs. And it had nothing to do with the fact that I didn't like the show. It had to do with the fact that, like you said, there's like 8 Smurfs in the scene. So now instead of animating one character for it's 12 drawings per second.
Mm-hmm.
So if you've got a 5-second scene, you got like 60 drawings to do. Well, now if you have that same scene with 8 characters in it, you've got 8 times the animation to do for that same 5 seconds. And it was just grueling. I had a scene where the Smurfs were doing a tug of war. So you had 4 on one side, 4 on the other side. And of course, they all have to pull at a different timing and everything else. It wasn't like you could just copy the same timing. Otherwise, it would just look, too plastic.
Right.
But that was a headache, and then you have to do a certain number of frames per week. And now you're spending all this time in this one scene with 8 characters in it. But they would usually feed you some scenes that had very little work in it so that you could come up to your average, and they knew, that you had a couple of bad scenes.
Right.
And that way you wouldn't get in trouble.
Okay. I don't know how you kept all those Smurfs in line through all of those. So going into, let's talk about He-Man and Masters of the Universe. So the first season of He-Man was like classic sword and sorcery. And then the second season leaned more towards techno-futuristic directions. Do you know what made that change in between Filmation and Mattel of the direction of the seasons?
Man, I really don't. And I will tell you, though, that, we did 130 episodes of He-Man.
Mm-hmm.
And it was only for 2 years. Because if you took a 13 episode season, that's 10 years worth of He-Man seasons we did in 2 years. And I think the writers just said, we have to come up with new ideas. And I think that's probably what the change was. After 65 episodes, that's a lot of work.
Yes.
And a lot of storytelling and a lot of ideas. So I think they finally just said, we've got to, kind of shift gears here. And somebody probably came up with the idea of, let's go a little bit more technical and do that. But as far as, I wasn't in the room, so I don't really know what the changes were.
What the decisions were on that.
Yeah, exactly.
So sticking with He-Man, what are your thoughts on the new Masters of the Universe Revelation on Netflix that Kevin Smith has done? Because the opening is very much classic He-Man.
Yeah. And that's about where it stops. No, I always have this difficulty because you've got, I don't know, billions of fans that love the original He-Man. I can't understand why you just don't do something very similar to what we did. And that way you've got billions of people who are going to love it, instead of changing it so dramatically that you have billions of people who hate it.
Right.
It's happened every time they've redone it. They just, I get feedback all the time from fans, and they just don't like what they're doing to their characters because, they have spent their whole childhood loving these characters, and then somebody comes around and just completely changes them, and you're supposed to accept that. And it's like, it's just too hard to accept. And with the new one, Tila, who was this, very pretty, kind of warrior, but yet still really pretty and fierce, but still feminine. And that He-Man they had a little thing maybe together. And all of a sudden, the drawings, she looks like she's a man. She's so buff. And she's got her hair shaved like a punk rocker. And it's like, number one, you're on Eternia, you're not on Earth, so why are you giving her an Earth haircut? And they start to bring Earth problems into Eternia. It's like, this is the perfect place to get rid of the Earth problems. We don't need racism in Eternia. And for me, it was always comic books and cartoons were an escape from the real world. I don't want to watch the real world again on my cartoon.
Right.
Because then you start getting into this whole woke thing and people, arguing back. Just do a good cartoon, And so I thought it looked okay. It was the closest, I think, to the original as far as its look. But the story wise, I didn't care for what they did to the characters.
Okay.
And the animation, you can tell, is exactly what I said, repeat use of the same, we use some of the same scenes over and over because of the budgets that we had to meet. But they use the same drawing and just drag it through the scene instead of redrawing it every time like we did. Yeah. And you could tell that, and there's a lot of fast cuts because they don't want to do a lot of animation. So it's like a close up and he'd move a little bit and then a close up and then a far away shot and a lot quicker paced. And I'm pretty sure that was to save money because it's just too much to draw everything.
Right. So switching over to Ghostbusters, what were your difficulties of taking a live action property and animating it?
Okay, this is the big quandary everybody has. Ghostbusters was a live action show at Filmation in 1974. It's not the movie. There was a TV show with Forrest Tucker and Larry Storch, who were in an old TV show called F Troop. Well, they had this ghost busting business. Now those episodes we had like one season with them. That was it. Then, you fast forward another 8-10 years, and then that's when Dan Aykroyd wants to do the movie called Ghostbusters. So they don't have the right to the name Ghostbusters. So they came to Filmation and said, could we buy the usage of the name? So we sold it to them, I think it was for $500,000, and they could use Ghostbusters for their show. So the confusion comes because everybody thinks that our cartoon Ghostbusters was supposed to be the movie Ghostbusters. And it's not. It's from our TV show. And the live action characters, supposedly their kids came along and they sold or gave the ghost busting business to them. And that's what our cartoon was their kids. So that's why it was kind of different. And we had the gorilla in it. And so it really had nothing to do with the movie Ghostbusters. But in its own right, it was a pretty popular show. And then you've got these toys now that I want to get the toys, and they're way too expensive. It's really gone up in price.
Yes.
And it's kind of an underrated show. I think it was completely different, and people that tuned in thinking they were going to see Ghostbusters, the movie, were
Right.
shocked when it was so different. But they didn't really understand, that this was not the Ghostbusters they know. So it wasn't different. It was always this way.
Okay.
Yeah.
So here's another fun one that was submitted online. If Thundarr the Barbarian were to get brought back to TV, would you rather it be aimed at children or adults?
Well, it was actually one of the few shows that was actually aimed at older kids to begin with. I really don't know how they got this on the air back in the 80s, because there were some people that were really trying to keep anything that had any sort of violence off the air. And it was pretty rough as far as them fighting and the swords and all that sort of stuff. So I would like them to do it. And the same thing with He-Man. I wish they would just take our old He-Man and just make it for 45-year-olds now instead of 5-year-olds.
Right.
And that way you would catch that same group that is huge and give them what they want. Because if you go back and watch He-Man, you can tell it was for little kids. I mean, that was the whole idea. That's why Skeletor had such a kind of silly voice, is that if he had the big booming voice that you would think that an evil character would have, it'd scare the crap out of all the little kids. So they kind of geared it that way. And with Thundarr, it was geared more towards teenagers. And now, I mean, Thundarr would be really good if it was done as a real full-fledged adult. And I don't mean sexual, but I mean, with more action adventure. And that would, I think, make an excellent TV show, and people would love it.
So what do you think has been lost over the years with the Saturday morning cartoons being on every day, not just Saturdays?
Yeah, because Saturday morning cartoons in 2015, that was the end of them.
Yes.
And of course, it had to happen because now the kid. I mean, think of us. We'd get up at 6 o'clock in the morning, get our Captain Crunch, and sit down and watch TV until Soul Train came on, and then
Yeah.
you'd shut the TV off. But it was cartoons straight from 7 o'clock on. And now the kids can sleep in, get up at noon and flip on Netflix and watch 6 episodes. So there's not that anticipation that we had. I mean, I used to love Friday night, going to bed and going, oh my gosh, tomorrow is Saturday morning, I get to see my shows.
Yes.
And I couldn't wait to get up, and my mom would yell at me, why can you get up on Saturday but you can't get up for school? And it's like, yeah, it was just so good. So I think the kids of today are really missing out on such a great thing to do, to just look forward to it, instead of now it's just on demand. And that's, I think, unfortunate. I see why. I mean, obviously that's what's going to happen, but and there's no reason to put them on Saturday morning anymore. They were really expensive to make. And and what really did us in was when they found out that they could do something like Saved by the Bell, a live action show that they paid the kids almost nothing, and have it be popular enough that the cartoons weren't missed. So you saw all these live action kid shows come in place, and they were a lot cheaper. I mean, think of how much faster you could make them. So I'm sure that it was a big thing to help save money as well.
So that it makes me sad that kids don't wake up early anymore on Saturday mornings, that they can watch it at any point.
Yeah.
So you did do some animated motion pictures. How was that different work style wise than the Saturday morning cartoons or the weekly cartoons.
Sure. Yeah, it was like night and day, because now, like when we did Rover Dangerfield or Prince and the Pauper, we had months to get our stuff done instead of just days or hours. You know what I mean? And so you could animate something more fully, and if the director didn't like it, he could make you start over, because there was plenty of time to get it done. I mean, there was still a deadline, but it was so much looser than the weekly deadlines of, I mean, because if we didn't hit the deadlines in TV, there were huge fines for missing the air dates. And so we had to get them done whether it looked good or not. And with films, you've got plenty of time to get it done, and the bottom line is, get it done, but get it done and make it look really good.
Right.
And when we did a feature of Bravestarr, and this was in the late, I guess, mid to late 80s, and we were doing the regular show, but then they said, okay, we're going to have a couple of weeks off at Christmas time, but if you don't want that time off, we're going to do a feature of Bravestarr where you're going to be able to animate more fully. So almost everybody stayed. You know, nobody wanted the time off, because this was our chance to really do some better animation. Because bottom line is, we wanted to do really good animation, but we couldn't because of time. Now, it still wasn't much time, just having a month to get something done as opposed to a year. But still, when Tex Hex, who is the bad guy in the show, is just standing there, instead of standing there with one drawing, they have his mustache kind of waving in the wind. And so you can tell it's much better animated. And but with Prince and the Pauper and stuff, it was even better than that, because we could just take as much time within reason to get things to really, really look good. And so that was much better for the artists as far as feeling good about what you did. You know, we loved what we did with He-Man, but we realized we're stuck. We can't really, you'd get a really great scene and they'd say, "I'll just make them hold there and let them talk, because we got to get this done." And that was frustrating. But with this, it was much more fun. And I had a much better, I'm not like really slow. I'm not a real slow artist like some people are. I had a friend that was just painfully slow. His work was incredible, but it just, if you wanted to get something done, don't give it to him. It'll look great, but he's just not going to get it done. So for me, I was kind of in the middle. I was a little bit quick, but still took the time to, I was really cognizant as an animator to be sure that what I drew was clean enough so that the assistant could follow it. Some people drew so rough that the assistant, if he wasn't like a really top-notch assistant, had a tough time following what the animator tried to get across. And I wanted to make sure whatever I did got across without confusing anybody. So I took a little bit more time to make sure it was really clean. In fact, when I would do a really sketchy drawing, I'd usually go back and clean it up with a really nice blue line, just so they didn't have much work to do. And then I knew it was going to come back looking good.
Right. Well,
there's nothing worse than doing a really good scene and having the assistant kind of mess it up because you just weren't clean enough.
Well, and you had been an assistant, so you knew what it was like to sit in their shoes. So you wanted to make sure it was exactly what you wanted to portray.
Yeah, I knew the pitfalls. And I remember I got a scene one time when I was an assistant, and the scene was, it wasn't a really long scene, but there were maybe like 20 drawings in it. And the guy had a drawing of a character looking kind of away from the camera. And then the next layout was him looking towards the camera over here as he was walking out. And that was it. And the animator put a chart, and I was supposed to make him turn and make him walk off without any guidance from the animator. And it's like, no, you got to put a couple drawings in there showing how he's turning and what he's doing and which direction even he's turning.
I was gonna
So
say,
he
is
left
he
it up
going
to an
left or
assistant.
right?
Yeah, so he left it up to an assistant to finish his scene. But it's because A, it was a difficult scene for him, and he probably was under pressure to get more footage done. So he thought, I'll just pass this off to the assistant and that'll meet my quota. So, but I didn't want to do that, to the assistants that I had, because you don't want to be that animator that no assistant wants to pick up your work. You go in to pick up some work and you look and see that Tom Cook animated this. And if he's got a bad reputation, I don't want to work on this. I'll wait and I'll pick up some work later on. And I didn't want that as my reputation.
So speaking of your reputation, you said Smurfs was not your favorite show to work on, which is understandable. What was your favorite show to work on?
Yeah, we already talked about it. Thundarr.
Thundarr. Okay,
Yeah.
that one was your favorite.
Yeah, because it was very, it was pretty well animated. The stories were really good. And the characters were like right out of a comic book. I mean, it was Jack Kirby, who was the creator of all the Marvel Universe practically. Hulk and Iron Man and Fantastic Four and Thor, everybody that you think of, Jack Kirby was one of the creators of it. And Jack Kirby created Thundarr. And he did a lot of the character designs, and he was a little bit angry because they used some of his designs in Star Wars. I mean, he created a character called Darkseid, and who had a very familiar looking helmet that ended up on Darth Vader. And then so he kind of took some ideas from Star Wars and put it in like a Wookiee. Instead, we had Ookla the Mock, which was the big character in Thundarr. And they had kind of lightsabers, but they called them sun swords. So it was a really cool storyline about post-apocalyptic Earth, where a comet had gone between the Earth and the moon and broke the moon in half and caused these volcanoes and tidal waves, and it wiped out all of Earth except for the barbarians and the sorcerers. And then they were kind of fighting for who was going to, control the Earth. So, I mean, that's a pretty cool storyline, for a cartoon.
Yeah.
So I really enjoyed working on that the most. And that's the one I would love to see them really come back and do a really good job on. I'd love it.
That's one I would love to see come back,
yeah.
personally. So does it surprise you how much love and admiration and how many people still remember all of the Saturday morning cartoons and the timing jobs that you did? Like, does it surprise you how much people still remember those?
Well, the reason it doesn't surprise me is because I'm one of those guys too. I was probably 8 years old when Saturday morning cartoons started in 1960. So as a kid, I fell into exactly the same thing. I loved, there was a show called Crusader Rabbit. Most people don't even know what it is, but it was very much like Rocky and Bullwinkle as far as the character designs. And then Rocky and Bullwinkle, or when Huckleberry Hound and Yogi Bear and Quick Draw McGraw and Augie Doggy, Doggy Daddy, Snooper and Blabber, all those great Hanna-Barbera cartoons. That was my childhood. That's what I hear all the time is, hey, you drew my childhood. Well, yeah, but that was my childhood. So I understand exactly where today's fan is as far as loving what I did. It's just weird that I'm the one that did it. You know what I'm saying? It's like when I was a kid, I would have loved to have had Comic-Cons so I could have met Dawes Butler, the voice of Yogi Bear and Quick Draw and Elroy, but we didn't have anything like that. I would love to have met some of the artists that drew those cartoons. Didn't have Comic-Cons. So now that's what they're doing, is they're coming to me and they're seeing that I worked on He-Man. I mean, that was huge. So I understand because I can put myself in their shoes. It's just really, really weird that it's me. I mean, who wants my autograph or a photo with me? I don't understand it, except I understand it because that's what I would have wanted if I was in their shoes. I mean, I went up to Jack Kirby when I met him at Ruby Spears, because I met him in the studio because he was designing Thundarr, and he was like my big hero. And so I'm sitting there just, tongue tied. I can hardly talk to him. And he's sitting there thinking, it's just me. I did comic books. What's the big deal? Well, to me, it was a big deal.
Right.
This was, like I said, this was my childhood. He was one of the reasons I wanted to learn to draw, that I ended up getting into this business completely by accident. So that's the connection, and that's what I can understand, and I love it. I love being the guy that helped these guys to have a terrific childhood. Now there was many more. I mean, it wasn't just me. We probably had 60 animators, but many of them were already in their 50s or 60s when I was working as a 20 or 26-year-old. And so they're all passed away. And I mean, I'm going to be 70 next year. And so there's not many of us. I started pretty young. So it's really fun to go out and really meet these people and give them that experience that I would love to have, was I in their shoes.
Yes.
Yeah.
It is definitely, it's definitely looking at everything you've done. I'm like, this was what I watched every morning and was mad when it was not Saturday, or my mom made plans for us on Saturday to where I'd have to miss some shows.
Yeah, exactly.
So here's a fun question. If there was a Mount Rushmore of animators, who would the four faces be and why?
Oh man. All right, well, Walt Disney has to be up there because he did the impossible by making Snow White. I mean, that was just amazing. They'd never done anything of that quality up to that point. And so that's why that's like my favorite movie, just because I can't believe what they did. You probably would have to put, I think I put Bob Clampett, because he was kind of the creator of Bugs Bunny. And he was my favorite director of the Warner Brother cartoons. I liked his cartoons were like the craziest and the funniest. God. And I'd have to put Five Faces, I think, because I'd have to put Hanna-Barbera up there, because they took animation from Tom and Jerry, the movie animation that they did when you go to a movie and see a cartoon first. When that got too expensive, they had to figure out a way to make profit for being able to do animation on TV. So they came up with the limited animation idea, where a character would walk in and then it would be the same drawing just held there, and then the character's head could turn or they could just talk. That way you could save a lot of money on the drawings and still have a great storyline with the Flintstones. I mean, the Flintstones was one of the best, sitcoms of its time, and it was drawn. So that was really cool. And then I'd have to put Lou Scheimer up there, the head of Filmation, for the fact that he kept the work in the United States when everybody else went for the bucks. He wanted to make sure that the animators that he loved and grew up with had work. And if not for him, I would have had 4 years in the animation industry and I would have been out. So with Filmation and doing what he did, it really changed all of our lives. Everybody worked at Filmation. The work was less quality because we had such stringent, budgets we had to stick to, because we're competing against Japan and Korea that are paying their people like nothing. But yet we still came up with He-Man, which is pretty well animated, even though it was that limited system. And so, yeah, I think those would be, you could maybe put, I can't remember the guy's name that did Gertie the Dinosaur. He kind of was one of the first animators ever. Maybe you'd stick him up there, but I still think Walt was the king of them all, just for coming up with the ideas and spending so much of his own money to make sure that he could do what he did.
It's really a good, that would be a good mountain.
It would be.
So what advice would you give to someone who's wanting to break into the animation industry now?
This is like one of the typical questions I get.
Yes.
My usual quip is go to law school because then you'll have a job. Because there's no jobs in animation right now. I mean, you might be able to work if you live in LA and you get in with like, Nickelodeon or Cartoon Network or something. You might be able to do like storyboarding. But if you want to be an animator, I really don't know. I know for a long time there was no work here. It was all done in the Philippines or Thailand or even Vietnam. I don't know if with the computers, if they brought some of it back. But I'm just here to say that this was not an easy life. I didn't get married until I was 38 and basically out of the business, just because I couldn't afford to be married. It was too, I made good money when I was working, but there were layoffs at the end of the year. And then you had to save all that money so you could pay your rent and everything. And it really wasn't until Filmation that I had a year-round job, where we never got laid off. But with Hanna-Barbera, ABC, CBS, and NBC had to decide what shows they were going to renew, what shows they were going to pick the new ones. So at the end of the year, we'd get laid off for 3, sometimes 4 months, waiting for them to decide. And then we get hired back with whatever studio happened to start up first. That's why I jumped around a few times, because Ruby Spears happened to start up before Hanna-Barbera. So I moved over there, even though I'd never worked there before, but I needed work. So that's the thing, is it's just really, I never could have bought a house. I mean, I didn't buy a house until I was really out of the business too. And it was just too much of a risk to put all that money into something and then maybe lose it just because the animation industry had a bad year.
Right.
I understand wanting to be in it because it's fun. But I'd do everything to find some other job than an animator. I hate to say that, but if you're really hell-bent, you got to go to LA and you got to get connected with one of those studios that's still there. And even if you have to be the receptionist to start, that'll get you so that the people know who you are, and now you can start showing your work to them, and they're not going to just say we're not hiring.
Right.
We had numerous people that came into Filmation and started out as a receptionist, and they meet the studio heads, and next thing you know, they're moving up to production managers because they like them, and it gives them a chance to show that they're organized and they'd be a good producer or whatever. And so they moved into jobs that they never were qualified for, but because they had the ear of the head of the studio and they were liked, they gave them a shot.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So I've got a couple more questions, and then I'm going to check online to see if anybody else has submitted any questions.
Sure.
You did art and drawing and animating for so long. Do you still do it as a hobby now that you're retired, or what are your current hobbies?
Well, no, I wouldn't draw ever again if it weren't for Comic-Cons. Comic-Cons, people want commissions and stuff, so I'll do them for them. But when you draw for so long, and I know people that they would go on their lunch hour and they would go to the park and draw people in the park when they weren't drawing in the studio. That wasn't me. I didn't love drawing so much. I loved the animating. Mm-hmm. I liked making characters move and looking at it later and going, man, that looks really good. That really looks like it's a human doing what I did, and it's all out of my head. So that's what I like to do. So it's like I said about comic books. If I could have just drawn the characters, that would have been fine. But when you have to do the backgrounds and everything, I just wasn't interested in that. So in animation, that was my chance because there's a background department that does all the backgrounds. I never had to touch a background. And so that was my thing, is making things move. And of course, it's such a long process that to be here in my studio and say, hey, I'm gonna do a scene this week. I don't want to do a scene. It's painstaking, it's hard. And for what end? So I can flip it and say, look, this looks cool. So I really don't draw much, except for when people want me to do something for them, and then I will do that.
Okay. So
Yeah.
what are your hobbies that you have that you enjoy doing in your spare time now?
Yeah. My, number one really hobby is going to Comic-Cons. I mean, I like to do maybe 2 a month. I like a little bit of time off because it's grueling going to airports and being on planes for 10, 12 hours at a time. But I love doing it because I love meeting the fans. And there's pretty good money in it. I do pretty well when I go to a show. But it's really the feedback of the fans, and to be able to walk out of there knowing that a whole bunch of people were really happy just to meet stupid old me. You know what I'm saying? It's again, like I said about me. I know what I would be feeling, so I know they're feeling the same thing, and it feels good. To know that you met this animator and he was a nice guy and he was friendly to your kids and that sort of thing. Where I've had experiences where I've gone up to meet somebody who I really love and been treated really badly, and it's like, man, dude, what's wrong with you? We love you, and you're acting kind of mean to us. But other things I love to do is I've always bowled since I was a little kid. So I'm on a couple of bowling leagues. I've bowled a 300, and I've also got a 299.
Wow.
And just about a week ago, I bowled a 278, which was only 2 pins away from a perfect game as far as not getting strikes. I had 10 strikes out of 12. And so I really love that. I've been in tournaments and stuff, so I love doing stuff like that. I also still play softball, even though I'm 69. I used to be the coach of the Filmation softball team back in the 80s. And I'm still the coach of a team that I put together here where I live. And so I play that all the time because I still run pretty well. I'm in fairly good shape for a 69-year-old guy. And so I really love doing that. And, sometimes building stuff. In my studio, I'll build some shelving units or something to put stuff in. And I like doing things like that as well. But as far as drawing, the only real drawing I do is, like I said, I get a lot of people that want a commission, so that kind of keeps me busy doing that. But at times you get a commission and it's like, gosh, I just don't want to draw this. So sometimes people come up and say, can you draw this for me? And it's like, man, I just don't really want to. Sorry, can't you pick somebody I like to draw? I like a lot of Skeletors. I draw a lot of Skeletors, and luckily I really like drawing Skeletor, so that's a good one. But some things I just not fun to draw.
I can totally understand, especially if it's not something that you enjoyed drawing. I can just imagine if somebody comes up and asks you to draw some Smurfs.
Yeah,
Smurf.
If you want Papa Smurf, if you want Smurfette, no problem. But if you want a whole gang of them, I just don't want to do it. Yeah.
I don't know that I would blame you at all.
At any price.
So I know that you're doing conventions now again. So what else are you doing now? Are you working on anything additional in retirement, or are you just along for the ride in conventions and meeting people?
Yeah, that's it. I'm, like I said, I'm 69. I've been retired for about 7 years. Mm-hmm. And, drawing Social Security and doing, pension and whatever. And living in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. I got a really nice house with a big studio. You can't really see, but this is like 30 by 12. really high ceilings, and I've got all my collectibles in here, and I've got statues of He-Man and Skeletor over there, and it's just really really a nice place to come out. I got a big screen TV if I want to watch some baseball or football. um, I've been given a lot of things, and the nice thing about it is if somebody gives me something, I actually keep it. I've got a book full of drawings that people have done for me. And early on, they would give me stuff, and I thought, well, what am I going to do with this? Because I really don't even know who the person is.
Mhm.
But I don't want to just throw it away. This is something they really wanted to give me. So I bought a few books where I could just slide things in the book and use it for like a coffee table type book. And they've given me things like, here, I'll show you this here. I was in Mexico City for a toy show, and they come up and they hand me this thing, and it's a bust of me. I mean, I couldn't believe it. They got 3 different angles of me and did it looks just like me. And I've got a He-Man symbol on my polo shirt.
That is fantastic.
Isn't it incredible? And they did this for each one of the guests.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And so there's things like that I look, I don't deserve any of this. I just had a job like anybody else has a job. You work at Sears, you don't get a statue made of you. So this is one of those things that's a big bonus of going to these Comic Cons, is the people really, really appreciate your work. So you really feel appreciated for what you've done. And, they give you awards and stuff like that. And it's like, I don't really need an award, but it's awful nice that you went to this trouble just for me. It's really humbling.
Well, I definitely will say that we are very thankful for all the work that you did, even though it was just your everyday job, but
Exactly.
you definitely made our childhood much brighter, seeing all of those animations that you did and everything you worked
Yeah.
with. So I do want to say thank you, Tom, for joining us. I was going to say we're out of time
Oh, okay.
for today, and I'm out of questions. Nobody put any questions on Facebook.
So that timed out perfectly.
Yes, sir, it did. It did. All right. Well, thank you so much, Tom, for joining us.
My pleasure.
We will see you all next week.
Yeah, if anybody's in LA next weekend, I'm going to be at the LA Comic-Con.
Awesome. All right. So